Chapter 16. Those first few days, a toddler and a baby, were hard. Oh, how I longed to have family close by to help me. Thankfully, I had a phone call out of the blue from Bridie, my chiropractor's wife. Would I like some meals organized? Meals? Yes, I would. Bryony sounded thrilled at my quick response. A couple of days later, Bryony and Sonia burst through my door. In a flash, they were filling my freezer with lasagnas and chicken pies. My vegan days were thankfully over. I had become so depleted toward the end of my pregnancy that I was feeling lightheaded and iron supplements didn't work. There was only one thing that I could think of, a massive steak. My vegan chapter only lasted 6 months, and that was a good thing because I had never tasted anything as delicious as those lasagnas and pies in my freezer. Not only did Bryony and Sonia make sure I was fed, they also started cleaning up my house. Bryony spent the whole time cleaning my laundry room. I thought it was so bizarre. My laundry, why would she do that when there were so many other areas that needed it? Over the next few weeks, I understood. There was something so amazing about being able to walk into my laundry with its shiny sink and do the endless loads of washing without having to navigate through dirty clothes. My one haven in a messy house. I was so grateful for what they had done. The food and the cleaning was so practical, but it was more than that. Their act of love had shown me that I was now part of a community that cared. I didn't have to start my first few weeks with a new baby, being so hungry that I could eat the furniture. I was being nurtured and looked after. Tikva was only a couple of weeks old when I got some terrible news from Jerusalem. Karen, the girl I used to sit and pray with before school, had tried to end her life. I was shocked. Completely shocked. Karen, beautiful, beautiful Karen. Our 2-year age gap meant that we never hung out as friends, but she was more of a mentor to me. She probably didn't even realize that, but her kindness and sweet nature and her integrity inspired me. If there was one person at school I wanted to be like, it was her. We had a connection because of our similar heritage, her mother Nordic and her father American. In a school full of different cultures, Karen and I slid into the same box. But more importantly, she shared my faith. There were other Christians in my school, but as far as I was concerned, Karen and her best friend Sharona were the only other real believers. Sitting together in prayer so many mornings had given us a connection, and to know that she had tried to take her life was too much for me to comprehend. As I lay there at night feeding my baby girl, hot tears flowed down my face. Picturing Karen's parents, her sisters and her brother, feeling their pain, knowing my community was rallying around them in Jerusalem. A constant vigil around Karen's hospital bed, a steady stream of friends showering her with love as she lay in a coma. I wanted to be there. I wanted to go home. Thankfully, Paul was making arrangements for that to happen. He wanted to study in Jerusalem, on Mount Zion to be exact. For him, it was a dream come true. As a theologian, nothing would be better. Our intention was to move to Israel as soon as we could afford it. Paul had decided before Asher was born that he wanted to be referred to as Abba by our children, the Hebrew word for dad. I thought it was a bit cheesy, but figured he could choose for himself. I wasn't going to do the same since I had no connection with the word Ima for mother. I was Mama. I knew it irked Paul's family that he was called Abba and that we kept mentioning a move to Jerusalem. It did seem pretty unrealistic though, since our financial situation was pretty grim, but Paul kept telling me it would happen. My main concern at the time was Paul's health. His eyes were red and glossy most of the time. I was learning more about health in my own pursuit of feeling more energetic. I was gleaning information about food as medicine as I was searching for answers for Asher's terrible eczema. I had never even considered reading labels before, just trusting that if something was for sale, it would be safe to consume. Surely the government wouldn't allow food to be sold that could be dangerous for us. As Asher's eczema worsened, I started to borrow books from the library. Paul's red eyes really worried me. I started paying more attention to them and noticing that they would flare up after he drank alcohol. That kind of made sense to me, but it didn't make sense that they were often red when he came home from work. Surely he wasn't drinking at work. It was also confusing, and in the midst of a toddler and a baby, there wasn't a lot of room for talking about it with Paul. He reassured me that his eyes were fine and he never drank more than he should. When Tikva was about 4 months old, Paul got home one evening, and I could smell him before I saw him. His eyes looked worse than usual. I asked him if he was all right. He seemed distant, but explained that he was fine. He had met with his co-worker for lunch, and they had talked about a youth program they wanted to run at the college. As I continued cooking dinner, Paul went and sat down in the living room. I was happy for him to be home and giving the kids some attention while I tried to get everything ready for our meal. All of a sudden, Asher ran into the kitchen. Abba's sleeping! Abba's sleeping! He was pulling at me to come and dragging at my shirt to follow him. As I got into the living room, I could see Paul collapsed in the armchair. Asher was pushing at him for a response. I called out to Paul and felt his face. I had no idea what to do. This would be my first time to call an ambulance. The operator told me to ease him to the floor and try to get a response. He was so heavy. He had a pulse, but there was no sign of life. An ambulance was on its way. The paramedics worked on him for a bit while I distracted Asher and held Tikva. The paramedics were taking him to the hospital, but we wouldn't be able to come along in the ambulance. I didn't have anyone to ask for help, so I called a taxi and asked the driver to stop at an ATM so I could take out some money. I had never even used our bank card before, but I was so happy I'd remembered to take it out of Paul's wallet before he was whisked away. When we got to the hospital, they took us to a private room. There was no bed in there. It almost felt more like a safety room. Paul was sitting up in an armchair. He hardly reacted when we walked in. I was carrying both kids because the pram wouldn't fit in the taxi. The doctor was asking questions, so I just stood back listening while keeping an eye on Asher. Words like medication, mental history, and psychosis were being used. I could feel something very cold growing inside me. He was healed, though. Paul was healed from schizophrenia. There was no need to have this discussion. I tried explaining about his red eyes to the doctor. I said maybe his liver wasn't working properly. They wanted to keep him in the hospital for observation, and they wanted to give him medication. I explained that my husband would be fine. He just needed some rest, and he needed to get home. I could see the nurse looking at the doctor in a funny way. Nothing was said, though. Papers were signed, and Paul was free to go home. He still hadn't said anything to me. It was almost midnight by the time the taxi brought us home. Paul fell asleep immediately, and not long after, both the kids were asleep too. I lay in bed with my eyes wide open. Something terrifying had happened, but I couldn't dare admit it. It was too scary to even begin making sense of. I lay there for hours just praying for my husband, praying for my children's dad, pleading with God to heal Paul. Heal him from what exactly? I didn't know. I just knew he needed healing. In the morning, I looked over at Paul, and I wasn't sure if he was still alive. He was so perfectly still. He looked just like Jesus in the tomb when he slept, but this was a lot more intense. I felt for a pulse. Thankfully, he was alive. Later in the morning, I checked on him again. His eyes were open, but he really wasn't there, and he didn't want to talk to me. Totally expressionless. It was hard for me to inhale. The coldness in the center of my body was pounding. I had no idea what to do. I needed more than prayer. I wanted to connect with my husband so desperately. I said a few things to Paul to show him I was there for him, whatever he needed. His eyes were open, but he wasn't looking at me. I went back to the living room and got out our little TV. I usually kept it in the study. I found the kids' programs. I knew they existed, but had never really actually seen them. Asher and even Tikva were hooked straight away and perfectly distracted. I went back to my husband. I needed him to respond. I needed him to return to his family and show me a sign of life. I knelt next to him. Our mattress was on the floor. I gave him a kiss. It felt clumsy, like kissing a corpse. I leant down again and kissed his face. Still nothing. I moved his blanket aside to expose his body. I had never done anything like this before. It was so foreign, completely distant from my experience. It was the only thing I could come up with, though, that might get a reaction from my husband. I would get him to return to life by having him in my mouth. I looked up at his face. He still looked like Jesus. He didn't rise from the dead, but one part of him did. A few minutes later, I walked out of our bedroom in a daze. What had I just done? Who was that man in our bed? I had nothing left to give him. I had tried everything. I went and sat with my kids and watched TV, realizing for the first time that the songs we sang at our weekly playgroup circle came from a show on TV called Play School. Who knew? Later on that afternoon, Paul was up getting himself some toast. A mental health team had booked in to visit him, and by the time they arrived, Paul was chatting to them as if nothing had happened. Next morning, he got dressed as normal and headed off for another day of teaching his students about the Bible. Nothing was said. No acknowledgement of what had happened. I watched him speed out of our driveway, wondering who this man was that I was married to. A couple of weeks later, Paul's eyes were redder than normal yet again, and this time I convinced him to have a blood test done for his liver. Thankfully, he agreed, and a little while later announced that the results had come back just fine. I was relieved and surprised. I took the opportunity to ask Paul to not drink more than 2 drinks at a time. I told him I thought that maybe him passing out after work lunch was connected to the alcohol he drank that day, and Paul agreed he would stick to 2 drinks a day. Life went back to its steady hum of church on Sundays, playgroup on Wednesdays, and Paul teaching or recording music and doing his weekly radio program. I told myself that everything was fine, and it was, except for when that cold feeling reared its ugly head. But mainly it was fine. I was staying busy, and Paul seemed to be all right, despite his eyes telling a different story. I never quite understood how, but at the end of 2000, we were able to book tickets to finally move back to Jerusalem. Instead of going directly there, we would stop over and visit my family who were still in the U.S. after all these years. My mother had finished her master's in counseling in Virginia Beach, and they had now moved to the buckle of the Bible Belt, Springfield, Missouri. My father was doing a master's of divinity there. I planned the route so that we could catch up with some friends along the way. It really didn't add that much cost to the tickets to break up the long trip. We would then fly to Sweden as well before we landed in Tel Aviv. I was so excited that I would be able to visit Mormon Morfar again and introduce my little family to the magic there. Johanna was also happy to meet up, which would mean us seeing each other for the first time as mothers. We left at the end of summer in February. I still couldn't believe it was happening, even as we had a garage sale to get rid of all our things. It seemed so unreal. I was finally leaving Australia and going home. We were waved off at the airport by Paul's family, me thinking back to us leaving Sweden as a family in 1985, how angry Mormon Morfar were. I knew Paul's parents were upset, but they did their best to remain neutral. As the plane lifted over Adelaide, I looked down and thought to myself that I had missed my chance of getting to know it. I had been so busy with motherhood, and I hadn't really seen much of it. I could see the desert stretching out beneath us, remembering how I thought I was coming to Australia to spend time with Indigenous people. Instead, I was heading to Israel to hopefully work as a counselor. Our first stop was Sydney. Thankfully, Paul had an auntie there, and we could stay with while waiting for our connecting flight. She asked if we needed to use her computer. Paul disappeared into the study as I stood on the balcony feeding wild parrots with Asher and Tikva. After a while, I could see Paul walking towards me, his face pale. He had just received an email from my friend John in Jerusalem. The college on Mount Zion, where Paul was going to do his master's degree, had just closed down. That day. The parrots were screeching for more seeds, but their rainbow wings were no longer captivating me. Closed down? How? Paul didn't have many details. John had been very apologetic and was hoping we hadn't left Adelaide yet. Paul and I looked at each other. What should we do? We were at a total loss. This was the whole reason we were moving back to Jerusalem. There was no plan B. After a few moments of silence, Paul asked if I still wanted to go. I did. So did he. We would just go and see what would happen. Surely something would come up. We flew to Portland. My main reason for going there was to show Paul the log cabin I had fallen in love with. I'd fallen in love with it and in it. It was such a special place, and it meant a lot to me that I could return there with my husband and kids. Mount Hood was just as beautiful as I remember her. The log cabin smelling of the wood fire, the feathered duna still as cozy, and with the snow lightly falling around us, it was just as magical as I remembered it. Surely Paul would find this place special too. As far as I was concerned, this was the most romantic place in the world. I had always wanted to spend time in a log cabin with my husband, and here was our first chance, and I wanted to make new memories here. My first kiss, now a distant memory. Paul knew this, and I kept waiting for him to acknowledge how special this was for me and to show he cared. It never happened. When I tried to draw close to him, he pulled away. It took me a long time to fall asleep in the most romantic place on earth. The feathered duna not protecting me from the heavy weight that had landed on my chest, making it hard to breathe. Why didn't my husband want me? Our next stop after Portland was Minneapolis, Minnesota. Sam was now living there with his wife, Carla. It was exciting because I had been told so many times that I would love Minneapolis, that it was so different to other American cities. Being a university town, it attracted interesting people from around the world. We were going to spend a week in Sam's tiny unit, but I figured that it would be all right since we could spend most of our time ice skating or playing in the snow and only coming back to their home for meals. As it turned out, I started to cough just after getting off the plane. By the next morning, I had a fever, the pressure in my chest building. I had never been this sick before. Carla kept disinfecting the floors and doorknobs, hoping to keep everyone else from getting sick. Paul didn't quite understand the seriousness of how sick I was and spent a lot of time visiting Barnes & Noble bookshop while Sam and Carla were at work. I was left with Asher and Tikva in a tiny home with no TV. How could he not see I needed his help? I eventually begged to go to a doctor who prescribed me antibiotics so that I could get on the plane to Springfield. This trip was not turning out as I had hoped. Surely things would get better. It was great to see my parents, who very quickly stepped into the role of grandparents. My dad reading books to the kids and going for little walks to see squirrels running on the power lines. My mother helping with baths and suggesting outings on the weekend when she didn't have to go to work. Abigail was living in Springfield as well and working at a coffee place called the Mud House. It was the coolest cafe I'd ever been to, and when I was able to have a little bit of time to myself, I would go there and order a frappe and pretend that everything was okay, although I knew it wasn't. I just couldn't be honest with myself at how bad things had become. Paul was away most of the day, bookshops, he told me, still working on his Hebrew. I had really been looking forward to this part of the trip where maybe Paul and I could have some time to ourselves while my parents were around to help. I tried to suggest it to Paul, but he was happy to find his own thing to do. He told me that he spent most of his time at Barnes & Noble, but his breath said something different. I overheard him asking someone about different breweries in town. Really? He was visiting breweries? Where was he getting money for this? I knew that asking him was futile. He always had some story, and because I wanted to believe him, I did. The alternative was too scary. I turned a blind eye for as long as I could. I spent my time looking after the kids and getting my driver's license. I didn't really see why it was so important, but my mother kept telling me that I should. Over and over, she would remind me that this was a perfect opportunity and that she could take me out driving while Paul looked after the kids. She had a point. After passing my theory test, my mom took me driving through a cemetery a couple of times. It seemed easy enough. I decided to go for my test as soon as possible, and I passed by 1 point. I was so not ready to drive. Still, not even used to being on the right side of the road, not quite understanding the importance of indicating before merging, but I had a driver's license. I felt a level of freedom that I hadn't experienced for a long time. I had been locked in the house for so many weeks with the kids, my dad attending lectures, my mother working, Paul supposedly studying Hebrew at Barnes & Noble. The only excitement was that every so often we would have a tornado warning and have to run down to the basement and wait as a tornado went by. I had passed my driving test on a Friday morning. The same Friday, my parents were leaving town for a conference, and the same Friday, Paul had decided to drive to Nashville to see if he could find a producer for his music. He was convinced that he was going to be famous, and Nashville was the obvious place to go. We waved them all goodbye, and it hit me that I had a rainy weekend with the kids on my own. I had to do something. I booked a taxi to take us to a car hire company. Thankfully, they didn't ask how long I had been driving or notice that my license had been issued earlier that day. I quickly got the kids in the car and drove off. Total freedom. The rain was pouring down, and it took me a while to figure out how to work the windshield wipers, but I did, and I was free. I was driving my kids to the Science Museum with the biggest smile on my face. Cars honking all around me, cars swerving as I merged into lanes without warning. At one point, going through a red light. I was so not ready to drive, but at that very moment, I didn't care. I just needed to get out of the house and choose to do something for myself and my kids. Paul came back from Nashville without a record deal. He didn't say much, but I knew he was disappointed. He had spent a lot of time recording his songs and getting Sharon and Alice to do vocals for him. He had really believed he would become famous through his music. Recently, he'd been working on a movie as well. So he began to pour himself into that now, along with his Hebrew. His desire to be famous was stronger than ever now that we were in the land of opportunity. Staying with my parents for such an extended time was not easy on any of us. When I booked the tickets, I thought it would be great to have a proper amount of time with my parents so they could really get to know Asher and Tikva and to maybe make some memories that would stretch out until we all saw each other again when they joined us by moving back to Jerusalem. That was always the plan. My parents had never intended to be in the States for such a long time, but their eyes were always on Jerusalem, even though all our belongings that we had stored with friends had been unpacked and given away. I felt desperate about Paul, but I had no one to tell. His behavior was bothering me on such a deep level, but I was too afraid to even admit it to myself. Things were not right, but I couldn't really explain how exactly. The thought that we were moving to Israel with Paul like this was starting to keep me awake at night. Jerusalem is hard enough to live in for anyone. The tension there can be too much even for the healthiest person. It's like living in a pressure cooker. Everyone finds their own way to deal with it, or they end up in a special ward in the hospital, the Jerusalem Syndrome ward. That's where all the visitors to Israel who think they are Jesus or Elijah or the Virgin Mary end up. So common that there's a whole floor level set aside. Now here I was starting to think that maybe my own husband would become one of them. It was a truth I didn't want to look at, but his fixation on becoming famous, his withdrawal from the people who loved him the most, and his obsession with the Bible was really scaring me. I started to look at Plan B. Maybe Israel wasn't such a good idea. Maybe life in Australia was best after all. Maybe we could do just what everyone else did. Buy a house, settle down somewhere. Paul could continue with his lecturing and preaching. I could finish my studies and become a counselor in Adelaide. Maybe try to tap into the Jewish community there instead and be part of some reconciliation between Jews and Arabs. Danya was doing something similar in Israel. Maybe I could do the same in Australia. I started to look at house packages in the Adelaide Hills. Could we afford to build one of those ugly package homes? Maybe Paul's parents could lend us some money. Real estate advertisements became my late night escape once the kids were asleep. The peace and quiet of Adelaide was exactly what we needed as a family. Bringing Paul to Jerusalem might actually be a disaster. I was sitting at the kitchen table scrolling through land packages online when Paul came home. He'd been out late again. I looked up at him, his eyes burning red and glossed over. Instead of his usual silence with me, he started to speak. His speech slurred. I couldn't believe it. He was drunk. Totally and utterly drunk. I had never seen him drunk before. My mother turned from the kitchen bench, and I couldn't bear the thought of her realizing that her daughter's husband was drunk. I had never told anyone about him passing out when Tikva was a baby and ending up in hospital. He hadn't even been drunk before that happened. My heart was pounding as I pulled him into the bathroom. If he passed out here, there was nothing we could do. There was no way our travel insurance would pay for a drunk, self-inflicted hospital visit. Why would he drink himself into stupor when he knew that this triggered his mental stuff? There, I said it. His mental stuff. I couldn't deny it any longer. My husband had mental problems and alcohol triggered them. I knew that. He knew that. And here he was drinking our money away and risking his mental health. It broke me. Totally broke me. I tried to talk to him and beg him to see how important it was that he didn't drink too much. We couldn't risk him passing out again and having another episode. What if he didn't snap back like he did last time? Paul was staring at me and not saying a word. There was no sign of him even realizing what I was saying. Words were wasted on him. I was desperate. I pulled off my wedding ring and I could feel its weight in my hand. I told Paul that I couldn't wear it anymore. I couldn't wear it when I had a husband who wouldn't talk to me. That he only spoke to people who he valued, and I obviously wasn't one of them. I wanted him so much. I wanted my husband. But he needed to start behaving like one, and start behaving like a dad. I handed him the ring and said he had 6 months to save our marriage. Do whatever you can in 6 months to get help. Talk to someone, get counseling, I don't know. Just be proactive and do something. It can't come from me. There's nothing I can do to help you. I'm not going to ask you again. I don't want to be a nag. You have 6 months of me not bringing this up again. I won't ask you about your drinking. I won't ask you if you're getting help. I'm trusting you that you will do something to change what's going on. And if you still want to be my husband in 6 months' time, then please give the ring back to me with new promises, new vows. Show me that I'm worth something to you. Show me that your kids are worth something to you. Not a word back. I told him that I would ask him in the morning about this to make sure he'd heard it, and then nothing more would be said for 6 months. I closed the door behind me so he could have a shower and hopefully wash off the past 3 years of our marriage. The next day I checked with him. Had he heard me the night before? Yes, he had. Did he understand that he had 6 months to save his marriage? Yes, he did. I exhaled. He had heard me. I just needed to wait a bit longer and I would finally have a husband. My dad spent a lot of time upstairs studying in his room. We didn't see him during the day at all, but he would always make sure he sat down with everyone at dinner time, eating his giant salad along with his beloved beans and brown rice. Every meal was the same for him, and he loved it just as much each time he devoured it. Sometimes he would tweak the beans by adding kale into it. I had never heard of this stuff, but he seemed happy enough. I would often join him. Beans and brown rice was my favorite food as well, and it was so handy having a dad who would soak the beans and cook industrial-sized portions every few days. Theological conversations and beans with brown rice, that's where me and my dad connected. It wasn't much, but it was enough. I had really hoped that this visit with my parents would give me a chance to connect with my dad somewhat. We hadn't really had a chance to make new memories since they moved away from home when I was 19. I would often get a letter and then a fax and now emails from my dad where he told me about his latest revelation about God or food. According to him, he was a new man. He was a new man with his health gospel. I wasn't too sure about the rest. Time would tell if the monster I knew from my childhood was still lurking in the background. We had already been there over a month when I got my answer. Asher and Tikva spent most of their days watching TV, which was so different from our Aussie way of life. My dad got stressed if the house got messy, so the regular crafts we used to do at home was not really an option. Asher and Tikva would normally spend hours cutting and gluing and making things from cardboard. Play-Doh was a favorite as well. Unfortunately, all messy activities. In the end, the TV became the friendliest option to keep everyone happy. I knew it was making my kids restless, though, and they were starting to ask about going out to the playground. I explained that we would try to do it later when Abba got back. Asher asked again, and before I could fully understand what was happening, I heard this loud noise coming from the top of the stairs. My dad was yelling something as he bounded down the steps. In an instant, he was rushing at Asher. I had left a broom leaning against the wall, and my dad grabbed that as he charged at Asher. I swooped Asher up as I screamed, "No!" to my dad. I was in total shock. I quickly grabbed Tikva from the floor and ran out of the house. My heart was pounding. I was in total disbelief at what I had just seen. My dad rushing towards my son with a broomstick, his face full of rage, his voice filling the house. Asher's eyes wide in terror, having never witnessed any form of violence, and here was his grandfather coming to attack him. How could I have allowed this to happen? Why had I risked visiting? The monster of my childhood, still alive and well, had now leapt into the storyline of my own children. I stayed outside until Paul got back. I asked him to take the kids to the park, and I explained what had happened, and I needed to have some space for myself to process. I sat at the Mudhouse Cafe and wrote a letter to my dad. I told him how we had come to stay with him, hoping to build a relationship, how much I wanted my children to have a grandfather, that as a child I tried as much as I could to protect my siblings from his rage. But there wasn't much I could do, being so little. As a mother, though, I would never allow my children to be exposed to that again. It's my role to protect them, no matter who the perpetrator is. I had tried so hard to keep my children away from violence and fear. He needed to know that one generation of Shermans had been so screwed up by his rage, and that he had a responsibility to make sure that the next generation would not have to go through the same trauma. It was hard to write. My attempts in the past to have my dad see the consequences of his actions had fallen on deaf ears. He had a total inability to take responsibility for his behavior. My dad's regular answer was to say he had forgotten most of our childhood. I finished my letter with saying that I needed him to remember this event, to remember so that he wouldn't forget and then repeat it with any future grandkids. He needed to do whatever he could not to forget this. There really wasn't much more that I could write. Our visit was coming to an end, and a few days later we said our goodbyes. As usual, nothing resolved, but my mother apologizing for my dad and saying she was so sorry it had happened. We were flying out of New York and got handed a silver dollar coin in mint condition as we boarded the plane. We were on the inaugural SAS flight to Copenhagen. Everyone seemed to be celebrating. It suited my mood because I was so grateful to be getting out of America. It had been such a hard and challenging visit. I tried to think back to a day where anything had made sense, just one moment that made the trip worth it. The only thing that stood out was a day we spent as a family in a Japanese garden. My brothers had come over for a weekend to visit. We'd spent a few hours walking through miniature gardens and ponds, over bridges and beside decorative statues. Such unfamiliar territory for a family. I caught a glimpse of my parents holding hands. For anyone seeing us in that garden, we would have looked like a normal family. That was my one happy memory from over 2 months in America. Sweden was a breath of fresh air. I could feel myself exhaling deeply. The salty ocean air in Falsterbo was exactly what I needed. Mormor and Morfar's house was still smelling exactly how I remembered it. My kids running over the tiny hill next to their house and spending hours at the playground less than a minute away. This is what they needed, space and fresh air. My body felt happy, happier than it had for a long time. I went for a bike ride with Morfar, down the small streets with the storybook houses, through the forest on the mossy paths. Down to the harbor, hearing the ropes smacking against the mast and the boats lined up. One of my favorite sounds. The seagulls screeching. Down my favorite path along the ocean. The reeds and the sand dunes feeling so familiar. The migrating birds flying in formation above me. My heart bursting as my senses were coming alive with so much beauty. The rare feeling of being connected to a place. I knew I didn't belong here, but I felt so free and at peace. I followed Morfar with his perfect posture, him sticking his arm out completely straight to give warning to passing motorists of us turning, exactly as he had done when I was a child, following behind him. Nothing had changed. My life in Falsterbo was my one constant, the only part of my childhood that still remained. I inhaled the sea as much as I could, recharging those parts of me that needed to be connected to the ocean. I didn't want this bike ride to finish. I got to have one day with Johanna, one crazy day of her helping me buy a second-hand Emma Junge pram so I would have something in Jerusalem to push my kids around in while walking everywhere. She found one in Lund, the town I was born in, so we caught the train and rushed through the maze of cobbled streets trying to find this elusive pram. Both of us laughing at us being mothers now, swapping our childhood adventures to running through streets searching for prams. It didn't matter that we hardly ever saw each other anymore, or the little contact we had. The instant we were together, it was as if nothing had changed. Our connection just as strong. We only spent a few days in Sweden, but it was worth it. My time with Mormon Morph are so precious. I had tried as much as possible to soak up my time with him, knowing full well that this opportunity was quickly slipping away as I could see the years take their toll. Mormor still painting despite her eyesight diminishing, and Morfar now needing to help her more and more in the kitchen. I hugged them tightly as we said our goodbyes, trying to inhale their smell deep into my being. Israel was next. Sweden had been exactly what I needed. A balm. Everything would be okay. I was going home and we could make it work. The hills of Jerusalem were waiting for me. Hummus with warm pita, watermelon with feta, cardamom coffee in the old city. I was returning to where I left my heart so many years ago. John had helped arrange for us to use an apartment that was empty after an American family went back home earlier than expected. He warned us that it would be unfurnished and small, but I was just happy that we would have our own space and not feel as if we were intruding on anyone. When you live in Jerusalem, it's so common to have people come and stay, and there's always room for another mattress on the floor. I knew that Liz would offer for us to stay, but I felt with there being 4 of us, it might not be such a good idea, especially with one of us being in a pretty unfriendly headspace. I shouldn't have worried. Paul was thrilled to be back in Jerusalem. His gloominess left behind on the plane as we landed in Tel Aviv. He had a spring in his step. His energy levels were high and he was constantly out and about, meeting with his friends. Well, my friends, who are now his friends. It was so great to see him happy. I watched him with John and the other guys and was reminded of the man I married. Of course, once we returned to our apartment, he was back to his regular silent self, but at least socially he was interactive and having fun, and it gave me some sense of hope that things were improving. I knew that he would go to bars and drink, but I stuck to my promise of not saying anything about it for 6 months, and I trusted that he was sticking to the 2 drinks. The pram that Johanna and I had hunted down in Lund was perfect on the hilly streets of Jerusalem. I was able to take Asher and Tikva anywhere I wanted to go. Our tiny little apartment was in the German colony, so it meant that I could walk into the city center, feeling the hustle and bustle that I was so familiar with. I could walk to Liz's house and sit at her round kitchen table as the kids played on the roof. I had made a new friend called Martha. She lived on Mount Zion at the college that had now shut down. I would push the pram to go and visit her while our kids played in the wading pool overlooking Jerusalem. We would drink cups of tea at her red kitchen table, her husband Phil often popping in to say hello. He was the caretaker of the property, and despite all the things he was called on to do, he always seemed to find the time to come home for a few moments. I saw how he looked at his wife with such tenderness and how he adored her so openly. I asked Martha about it later. Was he always like that? It really seemed as if he worshipped the ground she walked on. Martha laughed. Yes, he did. He really did. Every night he would massage her and tell her how much he loved her. Massage her every night? Really? I didn't believe it. Really? Every night? Yes, every night. Sometimes just a foot massage, sometimes her neck and shoulders, other times her whole body, but yes, every day ended with a massage. I sat in awe. I couldn't remember the last time Paul had agreed to give me a massage. Come to think of it, I couldn't remember the last time he had touched me. I looked at Martha, possibly the most beautiful woman I had ever met, a picture of calm, her children absolutely wild, but she didn't even seem to notice. Her presence completely different from the usual highly strung Jerusalemites. No matter how much I walked, I still needed to return home to an expressionless husband each day. I would ask him about his day and check if he'd heard about any job opportunities. Our friends were suggesting things, but none of them were what Paul wanted. They were below him. I knew there was no point in trying to explain that everyone has to start somewhere. My dad had worked in a factory when we first came to Israel and then become the manager of a bookstore in the old city. Jerusalem was like that. You just take what you can and then opportunities open. No, Paul wanted his dream job. He wanted to lecture or to preach. He wanted to rub shoulders with the top biblical scholars, men who had studied the Dead Sea Scrolls for years, experts in the field. Paul had a degree from a college in Adelaide and studied Hebrew in his spare time. My biblical Hebrew was still way better than his, and mine was pathetic, to say the least. How could he be so out of touch with reality? I offered to look for work myself. I could probably find something. No, he didn't want that. I should be with the kids. I had to agree. Jerusalem is a hard place to look after kids. None of the kid-friendly spaces like Australia or Sweden. There were playgrounds to visit, but my kids were so put off by the stench of cat urine. I was put off by the broken glass and the sand. My kids missed the freedom of Farsabu. There was no way Paul was going to be able to look after the kids for a day when I was at work. He could hardly cope with 15 minutes while I was in the bathroom. Liz offered to take Asher and Tikva to the zoo for something fun to do. It meant a day for me and Paul to be alone. I told them that we needed to make some decisions. We couldn't be in this limbo land much longer. I loved being home, but I couldn't stay in Jerusalem with Paul not wanting to accept the job offers that were coming in. His dream job might be around the corner. I didn't know, but I knew we needed money, and I knew that we couldn't keep doing this anymore. I couldn't live in Jerusalem with a man who was totally alive outside the home and then dead man walking as soon as he came back through the door. Not long after that, we got on the plane and returned to Adelaide. Total relief swept over me. Veronica belonged in Jerusalem. Veronica, the wife and mother, didn't. I needed to get back to the city of churches. I had to set aside my longing to be home in Jerusalem and look at what was best for my marriage and my kids. And sadly, that meant going back to the quiet streets of Adelaide. Alice and her husband were caretakers of a giant old mansion in the Adelaide Hills at the time. It was run down and waiting to be sold. We would be able to stay there until we found somewhere to live. The house was freezing in the middle of winter, but it was so good to be back. Alice was able to look after the kids while Paul and I searched for rentals. We found two, one by the beach and one in the hills. We just couldn't decide where we wanted to be. The ocean had always called to me, but being surrounded by trees and nature was so appealing. In the end, we decided to let fate decide. Whoever would choose to accept our application would make our decision for us. Both did, at the exact time. We were back to making a choice. I knew there was a church in the Adelaide Hills that was meant to have a very close-knit community. In that very moment, that is what I craved more than anything else. The Hills won. A couple of weeks later, we moved into a tiny place that looked like a gingerbread house. 2 bedrooms, a small living room with a fireplace, a tiny kitchen with ferns outside the window. It was perfect. The kids loved running around the backyard full of citrus trees. It was cozy and it was our home. Things were going to be okay. We started going to the local church that I had heard about. There were lots of young families, and it wasn't long before Paul was asked to preach. I joined the local play group and started to make some friends. Paul got his job back at the college and started working at the radio station. Our life had a bit of a rhythm to it again. I had stuck to my promise of not mentioning anything to Paul about his drinking, trusting that he was getting help. It was now 5 months since I had handed him my wedding ring, and not a day went by that I didn't think about how much I wanted our marriage to start afresh and how much I needed Paul to make some new promises to me. I deeply craved for us to be united. I started to wonder how Paul might go about it. What was he planning? Would it just be a casual conversation one night once the kids had gone to bed, or would he put some effort into it and make it into something more special? 5 months in Limbo Land had felt like forever, and I was so keen for a fresh start. Excited to hear from Paul about how he had gone about the transformation. I hadn't seen any signs of improvement, but I was still hoping that the work was being done on an internal level. The 6-month milestone came and went without Paul mentioning anything. I decided to give him the benefit of the doubt and stayed silent. It was now 7 months since I gave him my wedding ring, and Paul came home with bloodshot eyes. He often did, but this time I couldn't stay silent anymore. The 6-month milestone was fading quickly in the distance, and my 27th birthday was around the corner. I couldn't bear the thought of dragging the heaviness into yet another year of my life. Paul started to say something critical about me, his way of distracting us from the topic of his drinking. Instead of remaining silent or entering into the dialogue, I just looked at him straight in the eyes and asked him where my ring was. What ring? My ring, Paul, my wedding ring. Where is it? It's more than 6 months and you haven't given it back to me. His face was blank. The room was silent. I kept looking at him. I lost the ring. You lost it? I couldn't believe what I was hearing. You lost my wedding ring. Yeah, I lost it. Where did you lose my wedding ring? Again, the room was silent. I, I lost it at the Discovery Center. Paul had taken Asher to the Discovery Center a few days earlier. Surely he hadn't dropped my ring there. I took a deep breath. Paul, you know this is not about the ring. I actually don't care about the ring. Tell me what you have done in the past 6 months to get help. Who have you spoken to? What has changed? The silence was squeezing my chest. I had been waiting for this moment for so long. When Paul finally spoke, his words cut so deep. I haven't spoken to anyone. I don't know why this is so important to you, Veronica. I'm fine. I lay in bed that night with tears streaming down my face. Most nights I fell asleep crying, but tonight was different. The tears were burning me. How could I be so worthless to this man? How could he not see how much I desired to be connected to him? How much I craved to be seen by him? How much I wanted us to be together, to be a family, for him to be a husband, for him to be a dad to his children. I had so much love to give him, but he was refusing to receive it. He didn't want it. He wanted to be left alone on his quest for fame. The next few months were the hardest I'd ever gone through. I felt as if I was in a constant state of choking. I was making new friends at church and in my community, but I was running on empty internally. My body started to protest despite my face still looking happy. I had constant diarrhea and I got shingles. I was watching my husband get more and more preaching opportunities, more subjects to teach at the college, and even win an SBS TV script writing course. Yet at home he was completely and utterly void, dead man walking. No eye contact, hardly a word being said to me and the kids. Meals eaten in silence, his mind elsewhere. Again, I joked that I would buy him a microphone to use at home. I wasn't really joking, though. Paul came alive in front of a microphone. He was a dynamic speaker, engaging and funny, thought-provoking and inspiring at the same time. I longed for a tiny bit of that at home, any sign of life, but there was none. 4 months later, Paul finally agreed to go to counseling with me. He reluctantly went. My friend Alice watched the kids for us. It was an hour-and-a-half session with Relationships Australia. The counselor tried to get both of us to share our story. Paul didn't say much. He was there because I wanted him there. According to him, I was making a big deal out of nothing. As we were coming to a close, the counselor said to Paul that he needed to really start looking at some of his choices very seriously, and he needed to decide what he actually wanted. Did he want this marriage to work, or was he willing to accept it ending in divorce? Divorce? Paul almost laughed. Veronica wouldn't divorce me. She doesn't believe in divorce. Paul was right. I didn't. The counselor made a time to see us again 4 weeks later. In the meantime, he asked Paul to not have more than 2 drinks at a time. Paul needed to show me that he was wanting this marriage to work. Alcohol was too much of a trigger for the mental health issues from his past, and any more than 2 drinks was too much of a risk right now. A week later, Paul was reversing out of our garage. I ran back inside to grab a bag I'd forgotten, so I waited until our car was out and helped shut the garage door. As I waited, I looked into our yard. I had never stood in this spot before, and there was an opening in the fence. Not very wide, but wide enough for me to see a giant pile of cans and bottles, over 1 meter wide and piled up to my waist. As I sat in the car, I told Paul about what I had seen. Could he believe that our landlords had left a pile of cans and bottles behind when they rented the house out to us? I knew they were young and obviously had a bit of a wild side, but still, it seemed so crazy to leave that behind when everything else was left in such pristine condition. Paul agreed. He really agreed. In fact, he was actually engaging in conversation with me, which was so rare. Something started niggling inside me. Paul chatting to me was highly unusual. What was going on? A little voice inside me was saying something. I didn't want to listen, By the time we reached the freeway, I couldn't ignore it anymore. Those cans were not just any cans. Those were VB cans, Paul's favorite beer, and those bottles were long neck bottles. It hit me like a bolt. That pile of cans and bottles wasn't left over from our landlords. They all belonged to Paul. In the few short months that we had lived there, Paul had been able to create a giant pile of empty cans and bottles. He came home almost every night with two long necks to drink, and they went in the recycling. So these were on top of that. The internal voice was so loud that I could no longer remain silent. I had to ask, Paul, are those your bottles and cans? He denied it. I asked again, Paul, tell me if they are. Total denial, and this time anger. I asked him again, but this time I asked him to swear on the Bible. He was silent. I had my answer. I had already known. I had known from the moment Paul started chatting to me, his eagerness to speak showing me that something was up. If he had remained his normal silent self, I would have never let this moment slide. I would have let this moment slide. I reminded Paul that his drinking would split up our family. I begged him to take me seriously and to take the counselor seriously, to open his eyes and see what he would lose. I explained that I couldn't live with a man that lied about his drinking and was willing to risk his mental health on an alcohol addiction. I couldn't do it. I would leave him. I really would. He quickly reminded me that I don't believe in divorce. He was right. I didn't believe in divorce, but the mother bear in me did. The mother bear that was birthed in the agonizing hours of my first labor, she believed in divorce. She believed in children having a father that was safe. That mother bear that Paul was unwilling to acknowledge was alive and well, and would do anything to keep her children from harm. Only a few days later, when we were away for Easter with Paul's family, I reached for one of his cans of Coke for a sip and realized it had whiskey in it. I then looked at the Coke cans scattered around him that all ended up having whiskey in them. The mother bear had enough. While Paul was asleep on the couch in front of the TV, his beloved Simpsons not enough to keep him awake, I went into our room in the holiday shack and collected our belongings. I then told the kids we're going home. Once Paul woke up from his long afternoon nap, I asked him to drive us back to our home in Bridgewater. I was leaving him. I couldn't wait for him to take his mental health seriously anymore. I had given him my wedding ring a year ago now, almost to the day. Nothing had changed in that whole year. He was only drinking more and lying more and more. If we were worth something to him, he would have gotten help by now. We drove back home in silence, Paul not showing any signs of being upset about losing his family. I called Alice. Can I come over? I need somewhere to stay with the kids. No questions asked, of course. She would have the mattress ready for us. Paul offered to drive. He almost seemed amused. Was this funny to him? He helped with our bags, unloading them from the car. For me, he was never this helpful. He didn't even say goodbye. That was it. I had left my husband, and as far as I could see, he didn't even seem to care. The kids were thrilled to be back with their best friends and spent their days making cubby houses and fairylands in the rose garden surrounding the mansion. As the day got darker, I would count the moments left until I could clock off from motherhood and just cry and cry. I had walked down to the closest town and bought myself a packet of cigarettes. Each night, as the kids were finally tucked into bed, I would stand outside under the huge starry sky and smoke one cigarette. Just one slow cigarette. I didn't know why I did it. Alice would stand next to me, and we hardly spoke. We didn't need to. My marriage had gone up in smoke, and there was nothing to really say. After 7 days and 7 cigarettes, I called Paul to say that I was going to contact Centrelink and tell them that I was now a single mother. This would be his last chance to tell me he wanted our marriage to be saved. He told me to go ahead, so I did. I threw out the rest of the cigarettes in the packet and called the helpline up. I was standing in this giant walk-in pantry with mice darting past me, telling Centrelink that I was now on my own. The tears were making it hard to speak. Veronica Sherman, a single mother. My mind could hardly grasp it. 2 weeks later, I still hadn't heard anything from Paul. He was about to come and collect the kids to go buy some fancy clothes for his brother's wedding. His mother had organized it with him. All I knew was that Paul was arriving at 11. I was happy that he would see his children. They hadn't asked about him, but I thought it would be good for them to see him and spend some time with their dad. By 11:30, he still hadn't shown up. He was never late. By noon, I knew something was wrong. Paul wasn't answering his mobile, and our home phone was ringing out. I needed to go there and see for myself. Alice's husband said he would look after the kids so that Alice could drive me to my little gingerbread house in Bridgewater. It was only 10 minutes away, and my heart was pounding the whole way home. We could see his car parked outside the house. We walked up to the front door and couldn't see Paul in the living room. He wasn't in our bedroom, or the kids' room, or in the kitchen. The only other place to look was in the garage. I couldn't do it. I had this feeling of dread come over me, and I asked Alice to do it for me. Could she please check the garage for me? She could see in my eyes that I was desperate. He wasn't there either. Alice had checked everywhere. I exhaled. In my mind's eye, he was hanging in the garage. Thankfully, he wasn't. We walked back to the living room, and I saw the yellow pages lying on a cushion. I looked closer. There was blood on the couch. I flipped through the yellow pages until I came to a page with drops of blood all over it. I quickly scanned the page, and sure enough, there it was, the mental health crisis line. I started calling the different hospitals in Adelaide. He wasn't at the Flinders Hospital where we'd gone when Tikva was a little baby. I eventually got through to the Royal Adelaide Hospital. They asked if I was his wife. I said yes. They forwarded my call to someone who could tell me more. Turns out that the evening before, Paul had called for an ambulance, but explained to the operator that he didn't have insurance and couldn't afford one. He told them that he'd left his car outside the house with the keys in the ignition. Could they please have one of the paramedics drive him to the hospital in our car so he didn't have to pay for the ambulance? They said no. They couldn't do that. He had passed out while still being on the phone, so they came anyway and found him collapsed on the couch and took him straight to the hospital in Adelaide. He was in the psychiatry unit if I wanted to come and visit. I thanked them and hung up. I told Alice that I would drive our car back to her place. Since arriving back in Australia, I had a couple of driving lessons to get used to being on the left side of the road. I was still very uneasy about driving, but I knew I just needed to do it. She said I could follow her. We drove along the freeway below the speed limit, me clinging onto the steering wheel, me knowing my life would never be the same. Once we got back to the mansion, Alice offered to drive me to the hospital in the city. I knew I had to see Paul. She dropped me off outside his ward, and I made my way into the foyer. I felt as if I was in a movie, a terrifying movie. A woman was standing in the hallway, banging her head on the wall. There was a man screaming from his room. Doctors were walking past, not seeming to notice anything amiss. I could smell urine, or was it bleach? It was hard to tell. The place gave me goosebumps. I found my husband's room in the very back of the ward. I stood in the doorway. My dead man walking was now wrapped up like an Egyptian mummy, bandages from his neck all the way down to his toes. He turned to look at me. The doctor was in the room, and he explained matter-of-factly that Paul had cut himself all over his body. He had sliced his arms, his stomach, his legs, and his feet. Deep cuts, even his toes. I didn't say anything at all. The doctor left. Paul's eyes were wide, and he looked confused. Are you not going to talk to the doctor? Are you not going to get me out of here? I shook my head slowly. Paul couldn't believe it. They want to give me medication. They're telling me I need medication. I explained to him that it had nothing to do with me. If he didn't want the medication, he could tell the doctors himself, or he could take the medication like they had suggested. It really wasn't for me to say any more. Paul was shocked. I went over to his bedside table and got his wallet out. I took his bank card and left. I then spent about 45 minutes in the city shopping, a couple of tracksuit pants that would be comfortable for him in the hospital, and a new shirt and jeans for him to wear when he got out. A shirt and jeans that had no bloodstains on them. Also some new undies and socks. It felt good. I could use Paul's bank card and know that his money had been spent on something practical. No words could describe the feeling I had when I realized that I would no longer be sharing my bank account with this man. I now had my own card with funds coming in from Centrelink. From now on, I got to choose how my money was spent. No one would ever be pissing it away ever again. Once I returned to the hospital, I asked for help to transfer Paul into a wheelchair, and I rolled him through the corridors to the main entry. I handed his bank card over to the hairdresser, and Paul had his hair cut and his face shaved. I knew that Paul still valued how he looked, and this would make him feel better. I then rolled him back to his room. Once he was in his bed and his bank card back in his wallet, I said goodbye and left him there. Alice had waited for me and drove me back up the hill in silence. I got into the shower and let the hot water burn my skin, hotter and hotter. The water searing me, tears pouring out as the profanities started. Fuck you, Paul. Fuck you. Fuck you and you motherfucker. You shitting fuck. Shit fuck you fucking shit. You fucking fuck. I couldn't stop.
You motherfucking fuck. Fucking hell, fuck you, motherfucker. My body was burning. The swearing getting louder and louder. How had he allowed this to happen? How had he not gotten help? How could I be worth so little to him, the motherfucker? He really had fucked with the wrong mother. It was over. My marriage really was over. I turned the shower off and collapsed into bed. I curled into a ball and pulled the blanket over me. I wanted to sleep and never wake up.